Hello, good evening. Welcome to this one-day UVA virtual talk series. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Tonight, we are joined by a very distinguished and interesting panel of speakers talking about travel, adventure, and writing. Before starting the program, I want to provide some quick housekeeping items. To engage with the audience, panelists will answer questions submitted before and during the program as time allows. You may enter your question in the webinar Q&A. Please add your name and UVA affiliation. You'll find resources in the webinar chat. Please also note this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's podcast library in about a week or so. I will introduce the moderator and then she will introduce the rest of the panelists. Suzanne Morris Moomaw was named Director of the University of Virginia Press in January 2020. She's also an Associate Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning in UVA School of Architecture and Director of the Community Design Research Center. In her teaching, Morris Moomaw has spent the last 3 decades observing communities through social, design, and political lenses on local, regional, national, and international scales. Her teaching and community development challenges students to consider possibilities in order to create transdisciplinary solutions to the wicked problems facing us today, such as poverty, racial inequities, economic restructuring, human settlements, and lack of affordable housing through historical and cultural frames. So thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. Now I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed moderator to start the program. So Suzanne, please take it away.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome to everyone. Let me join Susan in just expressing our appreciation for your being here. A brief word to begin about UVA Press. We were founded in 1963 as the University Press of Virginia. But in 2002, 20 years ago, the press solidified its relationship with the University of Virginia, becoming the University of Virginia Press. And with that, retooled and recommitted to the goals of the university, teaching, research, and service. And we do that through publishing books, monographs, and our scholarly imprint, working with authors all over the world to advance scholarship and knowledge in many, many fields. In the chat, you will see an opportunity to a discount of 30% to purchase not only the books you'll hear about tonight, but any of the UVA Press books through the end of this year. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. When I approached Susan and Althea about tonight's program, the general consensus was that adventure over the last 20 months for most of us was sorely lacking. But to paraphrase author J.K. Rowling a bit tonight, let's now step into the night and pursue that flighty temptress adventure through the experiences of 2 UVA Press books, Almost Hemingway by Rex Bowman and Carlos Santos, and Journey on the James by Earl Swift. I will provide prompts to get our conversation started with the authors, but we will look forward to your questions and comments as well. So, by way of introduction and in alphabetical order, Rex Bowman was a journalist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch for a number of years, as was Carlos Santos. They both have published widely in national media as well. Their first project with UVA Press was the popular 2013 book, Rot, Riot, and Rebellion, Mr. Jefferson's Struggle to Save the University That Changed America. They have now written Almost Hemingway, The Adventures of Negley Farson, foreign correspondent, that we will hear about tonight. Earl Swift spent his early career as a journalist at the Virginian Pilot. UVA Press was fortunate to publish Journey on the James, 3 weeks through the heart of Virginia 2 decades ago, followed by Tangier Man's Lament and Other Tales of Virginia in 2007. Since then, Earl has gone on to publish a number of other books, including his latest, Across the Airless Wilds, The Lunar Rover and the Triumph of the Final Moon Landing, published by HarperCollins in 2021. Earl is a fellow at the Virginia Humanities. This is all to say that we are in for a treat tonight, which we hope will spark adventure in all of our lives. So let's get started and hear directly from the authors. Carlos and Rex, let me start with you. You wrote about Rot and Rebellion at UVA, and now about the multifaceted Negley Farson. How did you come to know about Negley Farson, and how has he changed your idea of what adventure could be for the rest of us?
Well, we started Riot and Rebellion. Rex and I met actually, or started writing together back with the Virginia Tech Massacre. Rex worked out of Roanoke, and I went down there to help out during that awful time. And we realized we wrote many stories together, and we realized our writing style was very similar, and our interests were very similar. And so we wrote Riot and Rebellion, and we had such a great time with that book, and it was just a great experience doing that we wanted to find another book, which is not that easy to do. And it's a story of I buy fly fishing books because I think there's a lot of good literature in fly fishing, and I love to fly fish. And I found a book called Going Fishing about 10 years ago, written by Negley Farson. Never heard of him. Opened it up after it sat on my bookshelf for 5 years. Opened it up after 5 years, started reading it, loved it. And I let Rex know about it. I said, this guy sounds interesting. We found out he was a best-selling author, an adventurer, a foreign correspondent who had been everywhere and done everything, and it was totally forgotten. There wasn't a thing written about him. He had fallen off the radar completely. And there is where we decided to research his life. His papers were in Wyoming. We went out there and just looked at his diary and all the letters he had written, read all his books. I think there's about 30 of them.
No, 13.
13.
You're so close.
13. It was 30 surgeries. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And that's where we decided to focus on this amazing man who had been totally forgotten, and that's where we ended up.
Yeah, and as for the second part of the question, how it's changed our perception of adventure. The question was something along those lines, if I remember correctly. This man did everything. I mean, he was nearly killed in Russia. He was nearly killed in Africa. He was nearly killed in South America. I mean, he had so many. He traveled across Africa. He traveled across South. He sailed across Europe. He just never. He lived in Italy under Mussolini, and he lived in Germany under Hitler, and in Russia under Stalin. And he went to India when Gandhi was leading the protests there. He sailed his boat across Europe basically by towing it 100 miles himself through a series of canals. But if you look at carefully all the adventures he had, some of them he didn't ask for. I mean, he was in an earthquake. He was in the bombing of the Blitz of London. He was nearly blown up in the North Sea during World War II. He didn't ask for those adventures, but if you look at the adventures he did have, they were always outdoors. And if I had any advice to anybody, it would be to get outdoors and experience life, because that's where adventure awaits. It's not in a cubicle, it's not in an office or your house even. And he just never stayed indoors. That it was not in his genetic makeup. He had to travel, and he had to write about it.
Great, thank you. And that's the perfect tee up to go to Earl. Earl, what about your James River? 3 weeks on the James River became an adventure to you, but also what about all these other people you've written about? The Tangier Island watermen, the highway builders, the space explorers. Did they and you think that these were adventures?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I guess my newspaper career kind of morphed over time, Suzanne. I started out seeking a newspaper job because a byline offers you immortality. That thought kind of occurred to me in high school, I guess, that so few of us get to have work that serves as its own monument. And newspapering is one of those rare lines of work that does. And so that was my initial draw to it. But pretty soon, my first newspaper job was in St. Louis. The paper was sold. I had to find work somewhere else. I applied to a number of jobs, a lot like at papers, a lot like the paper in St. Louis, and then walked into the office one day, and there had been a jobs board posted on the wall. And there was a notice from the Anchorage Times announcing that they were looking for 2 reporters. And I saw that notice and something in my head just snapped. I knew that that's where I was meant to go. And beginning with Alaska, I started to use the job more as a springboard for adventure, seeking stories that would get me out into the outdoors and away from daily life, and all of its worries, its meaningless worries, worries of grocery shopping and off-street parking and getting to work on time and that sort of thing, and getting to a much more elemental kind of existence where you weren't necessarily at the top of the food chain, for instance. And that kind of continued when I moved to Norfolk to work for the Virginian Pilot in 1987. The paper was extremely indulgent in letting me go out and have adventures on the company's dime, which I milked to the extreme, and they kept letting me do it. Many of my colleagues saw these ventures as complete boondoggles, but they involved a lot of on-the-fly reporting and dictating stories over the phone in the early days, which was a really hard thing to do, and I don't recommend it to anyone. And anyway, it just I did a number of adventures for the paper, and then they all kind of led up in 1998 to the paper buying me a 14-foot plastic canoe and sending me down the Jackson and then the James River on a 22-day adventure. And it was, so the adventure was really kind of the point. The writing, again, I morphed again later, and the Pilot really is the first paper, the only paper I worked at where the way in which I told stories was viewed as just as important as the meat of information they contained. My editors really taught me how to write there. And so the writing became more and more important the longer I was at the paper, and prepared me for writing books.
And just a fine point, Earl, before we go to the next question, these other people you wrote about, the highway builders, the space explorers, did they think of themselves as adventurers?
Well, I don't know if the highway builders did. They were a bunch of 1930s and 1940s technocrats in DC, but certainly the astronauts who I wrote about, the 6 who walked the moon on those last 3 missions. I mean, they had adventure pretty well stuffed into their bloodstreams, I think, from an early age, all of them. And the other people I went over for my second book and spent several weeks in the Laotian jungle and in Papua New Guinea looking for the remains of American soldiers who had failed to come back from the country's various wars, and the people involved in that search, that basically a military archaeological expedition, were very much adventurers and were drawn to it. It was an Indiana Jones kind of undertaking. Great,
wonderful. Let's talk about one of these adventurers, Negley Farson, Carlson Rex. What drove him to seek adventures on the one hand, and how'd you come up with the title?
I'll let him handle the title, but I want to say this. Yeah, he one of the greatest adventures, I think, in fiction at least, was The Hobbit, right? And one of my favorite characters, and maybe yours too, were Bilbo Baggins. And he has this great quote in there. I just love it. it's a dangerous business going out your front door. And, he was afraid of adventures, though he went on a great one. But with Negley Farson, it was the opposite. He was afraid of not going out his front door. He saw life from what we've gathered. In biographies you're basically building a man, researching a man through documents, letters, books. It's all the recorded history of his life. So we don't have his entire life, just the recorded history of his life. But it was very clear that he was scared to have a routine life. He was just frightened to death that his life would have no meaning other than that of making money. And he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and all his friends and everyone he knew, that was their life. They made money and bought a house and had children and got a mortgage, and then they died. And he didn't want that. He wanted something entirely different. And what drove that? What made him such an unusual human being? It's always hard to get to the very core of that thing. But he was driven by some inner devil that kept him moving, that kept him going. He wanted to experience life at what he thought was its absolute fullest. And in a way, he did. He had so many adventures that they're piled into our book, one after another. And they were just, he went out that door over and over and over. So,
and I'll say on the positive side of his character, he just felt that, the point of his life was have as much fun as possible. And to do that, you had to have as many adventures as possible. And the essence of adventure is putting yourself in the hands of fate or chance and testing your mettle. It's a form of brinksmanship. You try to do something and you're not guaranteed of success. It seemed, his editors, he was a reporter, a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Daily News. And actually what Earl said, Earl, I give you the highest compliment. You seem to be cut in the same mold as Negley Farson. They would send him to Spain, but he would say, I don't want to just go to Spain. I want to travel across the country by mule. Or, they would send him to Russia, and, he would report on Russia, but he said, that's not enough. I want to see if I can make it across the Caucasus Mountains when there's still snow on the slopes and nobody's done it before. I want to see if I can do it. He failed in some of his adventures. To me, that only proves that he truly did set himself challenges that there was no guarantee of success, and the failure is proof of that. He had plenty of failures, but he had plenty more successes. As for the title, Almost Hemingway, we chose that not because he was almost at the same level as Hemingway. It's like he's an inferior version. He's almost Hemingway in the sense that he's Hemingway without the baggage, without the insecurities. He never tried to aggrandize his own reputation or blow up his achievements. That's not what he was about. He was just about living in the moment, way before, the modern, focus on, staying in the moment and all that. He was way ahead of his time in that regard. It's like, he didn't try to derive meaning from any event. He just tried to do it to see if he could do it. And that was just a resolve that I think was in his genetic, in his DNA. If you'll indulge me, I have a section I can read from his book, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
okay. I'm not going to belabor the setup, but this is when he decides to travel across the Caucasus Mountains at a time when people said it just couldn't be done. He took with him an elderly Englishman named Alexander Wicksteed, who was a crotchety character. He's kind of a comic foil for Farson, just the way that Bill Bryson had his comic foil in Walk in the Woods. But they have hooked up with this Circassian horse trader named John Holt, who sold him some horses, and they're trying to climb the Caucasus Mountains in the snow. So this short paragraph, I think, shows his resolve. For the next weeks, their daily routine was an unbroken series of long climbs up the slopes of the Caucasus in wind, rain, and hail, followed by an evening of trying to dry out in whatever kosh or stone igloo they happened upon. Wicksteed bathed in the icy streams they crossed. Farson preferred sponge baths. The bandages on his left leg, they were practically a permanent part of his life now, were often sopping wet and in need of changing. Inside the kosh, they choked on the rolling black smoke of the fire. Then there was the ritual of haggling over the price of a sheep for dinner. Farson and Wicksteed had agreed never to pay more than 7 rubles for a sheep, and they never did. In the mornings, they stretched the kinks out of their muscles and headed back to the trail, always moving upward. Quote, during that time, I found that the soft Caucasian saddle is soft only in appearance, Farson noted. It is built over wood, ridged like a sharp roof, and just in the most inconvenient place there is a hard rawhide knot which gouged out an open sore in my behind before that very first day was over. It bothered me greatly. I picked this section because Farson had a lifelong leg injury. He was had a motorcycle crash when he was young, and then he re-injured it when his plane crashed during World War I. But he decides on this trek of the Caucasus with a leg that had 26 surgeries on it. He's got a new wound on his backside, from the saddle, but he doesn't even think about quitting. I mean, it doesn't even enter his head. And that's just the kind of guy he was.
Thank you so much. That's great. I think we all are going to have to get out and do a little bit more. This is all a challenge. And Earl, what was it? I mean, your 3 weeks were a challenge all the way around, but what was it that fascinated you before the trip, and what changed for you during the trip down the James?
Just to build on what Rex was saying a moment ago before I get into that, Suzanne, if you write about adventure and you write about people having adventures, as we in the newspaper business often do, after a while you realize that you're running the risk of spending your entire career writing about other people doing things that are remarkable. And no matter how elegantly you might tell their stories, at the end of it, you've written about other people. And so part of the appeal of getting out there and doing things, I think for me, was just having stories of my own to tell. And I realized pretty early on that the more uncomfortable I was in gathering those stories, the better the stories tended to be. And I imagine some of his failures were even more entertaining than his successes for that reason, because it's in failure that you really do find out where your limits are. But in the case of the James, I was in 1990. I thru hiked the Appalachian Trail. The paper gave me 6 months off, and I was a southbounder. And I remember coming to the edge of the Blue Ridge Gorge at Snowden, where the Appalachian Trail dives down from the heights and at the time it crossed the river on the US 501 bridge, a really narrow pedestrian walkway with logging trucks zooming by, inches to your left, and looking out over the river and being struck that this wild mountain stream, and it's a pretty good size at Snowden, but still it's shallow, it's moving fast, it's rocky. It was hard to reconcile that this was the same river that I was accustomed to seeing in Hampton Roads, where it's miles wide and oceanic. It's a completely different animal. And the thought was lodged in my head at that point, I'd like to find out more about this. I'd like to see where this thing comes from. And years passed before I was sitting with an editor at the Pilot, and apropos of nothing we'd been discussing, he suggested, I think it'd be a really good story for you to get in a canoe and paddle the whole James. And of course, I went along pretty willingly with that idea. I thought that it would be I thought of a river as a blue line on a map before that trip, I guess. I thought of it as a pretty static feature of the topography. And when and I guess the biggest thing, there's the James there. Now the dark blue shows the James, and the two light blue lines that you see at the western end are its source streams. Now its real source is the one on the left. That's the Jackson River. The other one that you see there is the cow pasture. They come together at Iron Gate, about 105 miles into the Jackson River's run. And then together as the James, they go 340 miles down to the mouth at Hampton Roads. But, I thought of, as I was saying, I thought of the James as exactly what you're seeing right now, a blue line on a map. And I think what changed most for me during the trip was that I came to see it as a living organism that changes not only mile to mile, but minute to minute, that's completely changed in character by weather, by the terrain through which it passes. It, the James that I paddled is not the James that I would paddle today. It's changed. Well, it's constantly moving. It's constantly evolving, and it's a living thing. It's an organism, and that was a revelation to me. And I've tended to look at the rivers completely differently since.
Just a quick follow-up question. What about the cities along the way? Did you see something that surprised you there?
Yeah, well, I mean, you paddle the first 90 or so miles of the Jackson. In my case, I hiked the first 20 miles and then paddled the rest. You come into Covington first, which is it's a brutal first brush with civilization, and the river emerges pretty bruised from that encounter. And your next real interface, other than little towns like Buchanan, is Lynchburg. And in Lynchburg, you have a city that at that time, and again, this is 20 years ago, it was 1998. Lynchburg had started as a ferry stop. It had been Lynch's Ferry originally. And then over the years, as highways were built and whatnot, and railroads, the city had pivoted completely around to put its back to the river and to face these new sources of revenue and people. And its waterfront was completely derelict. That's changed markedly since. But at the time, it was pretty depressing. And then you get to Richmond. And there is no city on the planet, I think, that has such a wild beast running through its heart as Richmond does. You've got Class 5 rapids in the middle of downtown. It's nuts. And at that time, the river was well on its way to recovery in Richmond. It also, through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, had been grossly neglected and abused. But by the time we made that trip, it was well on the way to becoming the showpiece that the river in Richmond is today.
Well, let me go to one more thing before I go back to Carlos and Rex. And the review of the book in the Washington Post said, quote, "Swift pays close attention to the river, not just because he has to navigate it, but because it speaks to him," end quote. What did it say?
Well, what it said was again something that changed, by the moment, really. The chatter that it made, in its upper reaches up in Highland and Bath and Allegheny counties was exciting. You're moving fast. You're in a mountain stream that's dropping straight out of the mountains. You're in free fall pretty much. And then that's very different from the kind of tidal sweep that it has, down below Richmond when you're in the tidal river. And, there are places along the middle James where you can look around from your canoe and see absolutely no sign at all that you're as to what century you're in. You could, and then you come across boulders on some islands in the middle of the river that were carved by bateaumen back in the late 18th century. And their names and the dates in which they visited these islands are right there for you to see. It's so you have a direct connection with the past on the river. And the river was Virginia's first highway, so it's had a central role in pretty much every piece of history that. Well, I say in the book that there is no feature of the North American landscape that has had such a direct role in American history as the James River, and you very much get that sense, that constant reminder that you're in the middle of something that's been around for a long time and affected people in myriad ways.
Thank you. Carlos and Rex, your book was reviewed recently in the Wall Street Journal, and the reviewer pondered this, quote, "Who knows why one writer's work stands the test of time and another's doesn't? Hemingway saw himself as an artist and Farson never did. It's possible that the difference is as simple as that," end quote. Is it?
It could be. Hemingway was, did see himself as an artist, but Negley saw himself as Farson saw himself as a kind of a working writer, mostly as a journalist. He didn't he didn't try to bring in the flowers and the trees and the background and the sky. He wrote in a very workmanlike way, and I think that was what journalists do. You write what you write the facts and try to turn it into a story, and that's what he did. And because it was nonfiction that he wrote outside his journalism, when he wrote nonfiction, I think tends to be more easily dated than fiction. For Whom the Bells Toll, written of the Spanish Civil War, well, it's still a decent read. You can still follow it. It doesn't seem, much of it doesn't seem dated. But nonfiction, for example, driving across Africa, which today, well, it happens all the time, but back then was an amazing feat. Or sailing across Europe. This stuff, travel back in those days was a difficult thing. And so what he did was amazing, but it doesn't quite make it today. And perhaps that's one of the reasons he was forgotten. Another one was his alcoholism. He was a Herculean drinker, 4 double scotches after his he'd written his morning stories by deadline. And I think that towards the end of his life, much like Hemingway, actually, the alcohol took over and he just kind of faded into the woodwork. But I think Rex also has some ideas on this.
Yeah, we kind of, even after completing the book, I think we see this a little bit different. First off, Farson, he had a very adamant view that people who seek fame are just a certain species of jackass. He didn't want anything to do with it. He was more of a mercenary writer. His prose still holds up today. It's muscular. It's to the point. It's whenever he went to any landscape, he understood that putting people in the landscape made the landscape interesting. So wherever he travels, in Africa or South America or Europe or India, the people he meets and describes are just fascinating characters, and you can't help but marvel at his ability to describe them. The alcoholism caught up to him at the end of his life, but he made it to the age of 70. So in a sense, he actually defeated his demons. He outlived them, had a full life. When he died, his contemporaries engaged in a debate of how many lives he had lived. Some said 3, some said 9, some said 12. They just could not come up with a number because he had done so much and witnessed so much. But unlike Hemingway, again, this speaks to the title. He didn't aggrandize his achievements in World War I or anything. He didn't aggrandize it's the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity, I would say. And I say that, and both of us are like real readers and lovers, aficionados of Hemingway. But I think Farson just did it better. He was just, he was a wretched husband and a wretched father, but in some respects, he was just a better, what's the word? I mean, I can't say writer, right? Because Hemingway is immortal, but he did things better. He lived a manly life, a true, honest way without trying to promote himself. And that's why he's forgotten today.
Yeah.
One little quick follow-up question, and then I'd ask the audience to get your questions in the Q&A, and we'll go right to you. His son, Daniel, at the end of his TV personality, as I recall, did some short videos or films of him at the end of his life, 3 or so of those. Did they reconcile at the end? And I know he dedicated the papers or donated the papers.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Even though his father was an alcoholic and, could be abusive to his mother, Daniel, I mean, this might be the case with sons of alcoholics the world over, idolized his father. There's never any kind of need to repair the relationship. He recognized that his father was unlike all the other men he met in his life. I mean, his dad was a doer, an explorer and an adventurer. and he could tell a million stories, you know, at a campfire. And you know, if somehow maybe it's some coping mechanism of young children, he put the alcoholism aside and just idolized his dad from, you know, from A to Z, and worked hard to resurrect his to keep people remembering his father after he died in 1960. You know, he came out with an anthology of his dad's work. He followed in his father's footsteps, you know, in Germany across the Caucasus. He tried to make it and he succeeded where his dad failed. Spoiler alert, sorry. But yeah, and then in his own biography, he devotes a large section to his father. You know, he just said, "My father was a great man," and that's his actual sentence, you know, period. So if there was any reconciliation necessary, yes, I mean, that was done, but I don't think it was ever necessary.
Great. Well, we've got one more question coming up. Oh, this is about the promotion code for buying the book. So I think that is somewhere in the chat. I will just say with that, the authors have offered to do personalized books, and what we're suggesting, and this will be information for you, if you would like a book plate, if you order the books through the regular channels through UVA Press or other channels that you might choose, but if you want a book plate signed by the author or authors, we would be delighted to do that. If you'll just send me a quick email, I'll work with Earl and Rex and Carlos on that. Okay. Tricia, your question is, how do you practice your craft of writing? And I would send that to Rex and Carlos our full screen. Why don't you start with that, and then we'll go to Earl.
Okay. First of all, I guess we should have introduced ourselves. I'm Rex. This is Carlos, in case anybody's confused by the names. Carlos, you want to handle that? How we wrote the book together?
Yeah, that's was she specifically asking about how to co-author a book, or about the craft of?
Well, I think more about the craft of writing, how you, right. I would guess how you organize,
right,
etc.
Well, you know what, and that's a difficult question to answer. It's somehow, if you look at co-authors, let's go right back to Rex and I actually writing a book together, because that's where you're crafting. When you're writing, you actually have two minds looking at one sentence and saying, let's change this word, this doesn't work, this does work. I would say that the craft of writing is, and I'm sure everybody's heard this before, is to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and redo and reread. And if there's any craft in it, it's just toil and blood and sweat. Mm-hmm. And there's no easy path to good writing. Yeah, and all you can do, the best advice anyone could ever have about writing is get a piece of paper and a pencil and just write every day, and write over and over and over and over, and then throw it all away and try writing it better, and then throw that away and try writing it better. That I don't know, Rex, what's your?
No, I don't have anything to add other than, I mean, all the advice I could give is a cliche at this point. You know, show, don't tell, use active verbs, throw away needless transitions. I mean, it's all mechanics, right? It's all just the tool bag. And working with a partner is actually, it's an amazing process, because you actually have to vocalize those rules all the time. If, like, I want to excise a word that Carlos has used, I have to defend my attack on his word. I have to say, I don't like that word for this reason. You know, I have to justify it with the rules of craft. And the same with him. You know, if the syntax is wrong in his view, he's got to make a case that the syntax is wrong. And honestly, I could say that, you know, like Earl, we have years and years, decades of journalism experience. That's the best place to learn the craft. And working with a partner, it only gets better.
Also, kill those adjectives
and adverbs.
Okay, Earl, you jump in.
Well, yeah, I think writing is misunderstood as a right brain exercise. I think most people see it, or a lot of people see it, as a creative undertaking. You know, you hear all the time, oh, you know, I'd love to be a writer. And often in the next sentence, the person will say, well, you know, I was never good at math. And I would argue that that writing is every bit as much a left brain exercise. That it's more engineering than it is sitting around by candlelight in a frilly shirt waiting for the muse to show up. It's assembly, and it relies on math to a great deal, much as music does, to work properly. You know, in terms of coming up with a propulsive, balanced, proportional manuscript, it's all math. You know, it's all deciding, you know, how to adjust the acceleration or the deceleration of the story. It's all structure. I guess the bottom line, Suzanne, is everything is structure. Structure is everything. You can come up with pretty words all day, but if your structure stinks, then it's like beautiful skin pulled over ugly bones. It doesn't add up to anything pretty. And so I guess I'm a bit of a structural freak. I always have been, and I over-report the daylights out of my stories. In a book, I would say 80% of my time is spent on reporting, researching, and 20% on the actual sit down at the keyboard. Because you're only as good as the material, and you know, your story is, and it's all about structure. The difference between writing a newspaper story, even a really long one, and writing a book, I think, is that a newspaper feature or a magazine story is like climbing the Matterhorn. It's tough and it involves a lot of climbing, but you can see your destination when you start out. And writing a book is more like climbing Everest and having to build base camp after base camp before you even see the summit. And those base camps are all structural. They're all organization, figuring out how to piece together and bolt together this narrative.
Well, while you have the full screen, and then I'll turn to Rex and Carlos. Tricia asked, what are you currently reading? What do you read aside from your own books? That's what I read of all of your books, but.
I read a lot of fiction, a lot of nonfiction. Of course, I have to read a lot on whatever subject I'm researching. So by day right now, I have to read a lot of stuff about the Jim Crow South and the early NAACP. But by night, you know, I'd much rather be reading a Gary Steingart novel than anything too heavy. And he has a new novel coming out next week, actually. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Great, wonderful. Well, what about the two of you? What do you read for fun or interest?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. I'm currently reading a book called The Long Way by Bernard Moitessier. He's a French sailor who sailed around the world alone without stopping back in the 60s as part of the global sailing race. But when he got close to the finish line, he felt, you know, I don't want to come home yet. So he sailed around, you know, a third of the world again before he stopped. So he actually sailed once around the world and then another third for, you know, just for sport. It's a great read. Before I turn the floor over to Carlos, I want to, I recalled a quote from Hemingway that echoes what Earl is saying about structure. Hemingway said about writing is architecture, not interior decorating. And that's just a way of saying it's structure, not pretty words. And, you know, I learned that when I was in my early 20s, and it's stuck with me ever since. Yeah. Over to you, Carlos.
Right. Well, I'm currently reading a book by John Gyrak, who is one of the better known fly fisherman authors. And it's called, the title is Standing in a River Waving a Stick. And he's got this wry sense of humor that just is, I just love. And so now I'm reading that. I love nonfiction. I'll read about anything. That's what I'm currently reading.
Great. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and so I want to go to both of you. And you all are full screen now for me. Farson and Hemingway were basically the same age. And part of the lost generation that included Gertrude Stein, E.E. Cummings, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and others, of course. What did we learn, or what did you learn from that period, from this study, in this book, in this research about living hard and free? Picked up that line from your book. Living hard is really the emphasis here.
Okay, if I
Go
start
ahead.
on this
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah. Keep clever now.
I'm a longtime fan of the lost generation, like people my generation, always were. That's what we studied in high school and college. But it's not just a pretty title. I mean, they really came out of World War I, lost and disaffected, and just totally disillusioned with the way the world ran. Farson's quest for adventure. Carlos mentioned that he hated the thought of grubbing for money and working a 9-to-5 job. That's what the world was all about when World War I started. It was like you get rich quick schemes and big industry, and everybody wanted to, find the right stock or land in the right corporation that was going to make them rich. And then World War I just blew that up, and not only for Farson, but for Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Stein and the rest of them. I mean, they just fled to Europe. They wanted to just live a sensuous life, away from the 9-to-5. And it really, and I know I read all that in high school and college, but like delving into Farson's life, I mean, he ran off to British Columbia and lived in a cabin for 2 years, surviving on the fish he caught and then the ducks he shot. He came out of World War I with an injury. I don't know what the rest of the lost generation came out of it with, but they had that same sense of disillusionment that he had, and that's how it manifested in his life. So, when people say they were a disillusioned lot, it's not just a shorthand for anything. I mean, I really believe it now. I really understand it. That yeah, I don't want to go any further than that, but that's what I learned about it.
Carlos, anything to add?
No, I think he's pretty much said it. Farson had, though he was a contemporary of the lost generation, he really wasn't a member of that group. And I think part of it was I don't really think he sat around and got all moody. He wasn't a moody kind of guy, and he in the end he really was he looked life right in the eye, and he was a candid man who spoke exactly what he was thinking, and he just didn't. He wasn't quite that lost in like those contemporaries, like those people. I think he just wanted to live a good life, and he did his best to do it. And he was, like all of us, he was a flawed man, flawed human being, and but lived an amazing life. So
Wonderful. Well, I'll turn now Mary's question to you, Earl, and that is about, and I have one to fold into that if we have time, is why you're reading so much about Jim Crow.
Well, I can't speak too fully about it because I'm pretty early in the process yet, but I'm working on a book that is set during that period. It's not essentially about Jim Crow, but it is set during that period in the South, and so I have to smarten up on exactly, we all, I guess, assume that we know something about it, and I've been surprised by just how little I did know so far.
Well, that brings me to the final two questions, and your full screen. Tell us a little bit about your brand new book and the Airless Wilds, and then I'll turn to Carlos and Rex.
Well, I think most people of my age who were just barely old enough to remember the Apollo 11 landing tend to see the late Apollo program, the moon missions of the 60s and 70s, in terms of Apollo 11 and then all those other missions. I mean, it's Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin step onto the moon. Everything that followed was pretty anticlimactic. And And in fact, kind of the thrust of the book is that every American space mission, going all the way back to the very first flight, 15-minute flight by Alan Shepard in 1961, was preparation for the last 3 Apollo missions, including Apollo 11. That they were all developmental missions. They were all designed to test procedures and equipment, and all of that work came to fruition with Apollo 15, 16, and 17. And all you have to do is look at the stats as to what they accomplished. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong stepped out of the Eagle, their lunar module, and all of their wanderings on the moon would fit inside a football field with a lot of yardage to spare. The farthest either man wandered away was 65 yards. Then you get to Apollo 17, and they drove more than 22 miles in the lunar rover. They covered an area the size of Manhattan, and they 3/4 of the geological samples returned from the moon were brought back on those last 3 missions. They remade Apollo, and that goofy, stripped down little electric car that they drove was a big piece of the reason.
Terrific. And I'm going to pull these 2 points together for a second and then turn back to Rex and Carlos. And that is, as we think about the generation that we have now, university students at UVA and elsewhere, hearing these stories, hearing the story about the astronauts, hearing the story about possibility, hearing the stories about what can happen, what can be an adventure, are absolutely critical as they're thinking about how to parse through their own lives and thinking about the world that they're faced with. The environmental challenges that Earl saw in his journey down the James, at least that I read about, the other world activities that Negley Farson experienced personally, but actually saw through war and destruction. And the fact that we got on the other side of things, I think, is a really important lesson as all those of us who teach and enjoy young people so much today. So I thank you for that. But I'll let Rex and Carlos finish us up and then turn back to Susan. What's your next project?
We've been kicking things around.
Yeah, we're working on some things, some adventures. When we get to the point where we've come up with one where there's an 80% chance of survival, that's probably the one we'll select. But right now the odds are kind of low down.
Right.
But we're taking a page out of Negley Farson's book for sure.
Yeah, and some of these ideas our wives don't like very much, so you have to negotiate it.
Well, as we close out, I want to thank all 3 of you for giving us this moment post-COVID, hopefully moving into that time. I don't know how many of you on the call are going to buy a canoe or going to do many of the things that Negley Farson did, but I hope that we all will be thinking about a theme that all 3 of our authors talked about. That's getting out of your comfort zone, getting outside, and we have the wonder of this beautiful Commonwealth to do it in. So I thank you all for taking your time. Thank you, audience, for being with us. And Susan, I'll turn it back to you. And thank you, UVA Engagement, let me say that, for allowing us to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Suzanne and each of our panelists for sharing their time and expertise and stories with us this evening. Special thanks again to Suzanne and the University of Virginia Press for bringing together such a wonderful panel. I want to take a moment and bring some upcoming Office of Engagement programs to your attention. If you have been bitten by the travel bug by this program, our friends in the Office of Engagement's Alumni and Parents Travel Program have a full roster of 2022 trips planned to places like Egypt, Morocco, Iceland, and Spain, to name a few. So you can find information about these trips and how to book a trip at engagement.virginia.edu/travel. And then on to some lifetime learning programs. On Saturday, November 13th at 10 p.m., please join Lifetime Learning for our More Than a Score program entitled The Presidency at a Crossroads. Barbara Perry, the Gerald L. Bayless Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, will discuss how presidents through history face inflection points in the evolution of the office, especially during times of crisis. You can register to attend the program in person or participate virtually via a live stream. Then on Monday, November 15th at 2 p.m., I'll be hosting a virtual program with Assistant Professor Christopher Ali of UVA's Media Studies Department, where we will discuss the rural-urban digital divide and his new book called Farm Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. So check out other Lifetime Learning programs, the podcast library, our UVA Speaks podcast series to watch and listen to UVA expert faculty. You can find all of our Lifetime Learning events and online resources at our website, which is at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. So with all of that in mind, and in the meantime, please stay safe and be well. We're going to keep the program information on the screen for a few moments. But for now, I want to thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.